Hey, what's up guys, I'm Josh, and today we're going to be looking at the third and final collaboration between Crinacle, the audio reviewer, and another company on a pair of IEMs. These things retail for about $199 US. These were sent to me, but as always, nobody is controlling what I say. All thoughts and opinions are my own. Of the three Crinacle IEMs I've reviewed so far, this actually feels a little bit like the odd man out. In a good way though. I do like this more than the other two that I've reviewed. It does demand a higher price tag, but I do think, depending on what you like, it actually is worth it. This is a much more well-balanced, I think, general sound signature, and it's less focused on being bass monsters, and I actually really appreciate this take quite a lot. I do think it differs from the other two, but I do think that technically speaking, this is superior to the others, and if I had to pick one, regardless of price, I still would pick this one. The design overall is pretty good. The shape is relatively inoffensive. I do personally prefer the comfort of the KZs that we tried, but I don't think that this is bad by any means. This is a very lightweight cable and a very lightweight chassis on a relatively safe shape for that chassis. The one and only complaint that I might have about this is that the ear stem is a little bit wider than a lot of other ear stems on IEMs. It's not the widest and craziest that I've seen, but if you have a smaller ear canal, that may be a consideration for you. Despite these being a lightweight design, the isolation from these is actually really, really good. It's not quite on the level of noise cancellation, obviously, but in terms of just plain isolation, I actually do think that these are pretty good. They do have a carbon fiber faceplate on the outside. Their overall design and aesthetics, I think, is relatively muted, which I do not think is necessarily a bad thing. This does come with, of course, a few pairs of ear tips and a hard carrying case inside this box, as well as some stickers. For amplification, you're gonna be fine with a phone, you're gonna be fine with an amplifier, and you're gonna be fine with a laptop. Now, this isn't a super sensitive IEM, so you're not going to be picking up a ton of noise floor. On some things that are really noisy, you might, but like in general, I think you'll be fine with any modern day amplifier. Regarding the sound quality, like I said, this is a little bit different than the other two, but I do really like it. It still is relatively within the V-shaped sound signature, though not nearly as aggressively as some of the others that we've reviewed. This tuning preference, I do think, is high risk, high reward. So on headphones like the KZ, I think it really, really worked, and for the money, it was great. When it was for the FiiO Eclipse, I feel like it kind of landed a little flat and didn't really perform as well as it could. Now, while this is still on the V-shape side, I do think it mixes a decent amount of fun with technicality and naturalness, which is something that the other two didn't quite do for me. I think that the Eclipse was way too fun and not technical enough for the asking price, and I thought the KZs were a good mix of both, but definitely just good for the money. These, I think, are good for the $200 asking price, which is pretty steep. All right, so bass response. This is not the strongest bass response of the three IEMs we've looked at, but it is the best technically. And from an audiophile perspective, this is clearly the winner of the three IEMs. This can really scale the sound ladder for quality really well. So this can sound thick and thumpy and punchy when it needs, like Terrace Martin's Intimidated, but it can also give you the environmental bass, the room bass, with something like Diana Krall. Also notably, of the three IEMs, this is the cleanest for bass bleed and bloat. It doesn't really have a whole lot in that area, which, given the higher price tag, I think it becomes an expectation, if not a standard, for $200 for a relatively clean bass response. But regardless, this manages to achieve that a lot better than the other two did. So overall impressions of the bass response is really positive. I like the bass response a lot. The mid-range, I do think, is again a step ahead of the other two, but I don't think it quite lives up to what I would really prefer in a mid-range, specifically a vocal performance. I'm a very vocal based guy, so this should be no surprise if you followed me for a while. Lower mids in a perfect world would be a little bit fuller, a little bit more engaging, a little bit more thorough. They would give a lot of male vocalists a little bit more guts down low and not quite sound so anemic. Now, this isn't a huge problem, and again, it is better than the other two headphones, but again, it is demanding a higher price tag than those other two headphones. Now, I do realize that this is sort of a byproduct of the tuning preferences here, that because you have this V-shape, you're not really gonna get the super filled out mid-range, but I do think that, you know, if you go with a mid-range forward tuning, you sacrifice bass response, you can sacrifice treble. If you go for a V-shaped tuning, a lot of times you sacrifice mid-range, and I don't think this is an exception here. Now, I would personally say that the mid-range is decent, but I think at the $200 asking price, you're really starting to expect things to be a little bit better than decent in just about every category. Now, even though I do think that this is a low point of the headphone, it's just a slight knock. I think that if your tuning preference aligns with Crinacle's, you will like this headphone just fine, regardless of my opinion on the mid-range. There is one technical issue that I do think that has a little bit of crossover with the treble response, and that's going to be where the upper mid-range and the lower treble meet, where they start to mesh specifically on certain vocalists that are really top-end focused in their kind of vocal range. Singers like Sia, Tones and I know not everybody listens to them, but those who do may want to be aware of this. I get a lot of blending here, and it doesn't seem like the vocalist really has a distinct stopping point from themselves and brighter background sounds. And I don't really feel like the vocalist has a really clear stopping point up there. It seems to be relatively defined and isolated in the lower mids and most of the kind of middle of the mid-range for vocalists, but that upper mid-range tends to blur a little bit. This is an area where I felt like the Moondrop Kato did a lot better than this. Neither were perfect for mid-range for me, but I do think that that had a better overall definition for vocal response. Okay, treble response. I really like the treble on here. There is a way in which certain headphones can manage detail without necessarily making it overbearing for the listener. A good example of a headphone that is detailed but overbearing would be like an HD800S. Yes, it's detailed, it is. But it's like, it's too forward on the information. There's no escaping from it. I feel like headphones like the Midnight can do a detailed treble response without it being too forward and without it being too fatiguing. Now, occasionally, sometimes in an under-detailed song that you may want those upper frequencies kind of more pushed forward towards you, this does feel a little bit dull, but then other times you just get this really lovely, very naturalistic sound on a properly recorded track. So this scales pretty well with the quality of the recording itself. Some headphones can navigate both territories well. I think that this can navigate good recordings really well, but poor recordings, not so great. What you're not gonna get is a super screechy, shouty, bright treble response. So for those of you who want to avoid that, you can with this headphone. I think if I were to be really picky here, I would want a little bit more technicality and a little bit more forwardness from the upper regions of treble response, leading from like, I don't know, like 13, 14K to 20K. I would want more from it a little bit. I think at the $200 asking price for IEMs though, this is a relatively standard performance for a good IEM at this price. One thing though that I do think stands out for its price is the imaging and the sound staging, specifically how the shape is developed on that imaging and sound staging, because a lot of IEMs, when you're wearing them, they tend to do this thing where they have really good imaging, basically like right here. And then when the imaging and the sound staging gets beyond, it gets outside, it tends to wrap towards the back of your head. I'm not sure what property about most IEMs gives me this interpretation of the sound staging, but this has a very good lateral response without being more of a wrapping effect. I do find this to be a little bit more natural, and I find it to be a little bit more like you would actually hear music happening in front of you. Granted, it's just slightly more towards that illusion, doesn't completely immerse you like a lot of really top-end IEMs can do. But at the $200 price, I think that's, not a fair expectation from any IEM. But the really impressive part about this is that some IEMs do that lateral response really well, but they sound tubular and closed. This manages to sound like that, but still sound open and transient without sounding locked in. So I think that's a really good performance from here. I also noticed that because it's got so much breathing room in that lateralness, it tends to not muddy up the signature on a really busy track. A test track for me for a long time has been Yoshi Hirakawa's Timbres, and that track is a great test bench for what happens when stuff just gets too complicated for a headphone. Some headphones really fall apart in that test. This thing didn't skip a beat with it, and it performed really well. Okay, so my conclusion. I do think that this is a pretty good IEM. I think that it leans a little bit more on the fun side and a little bit less on the technical side, given the price range, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I still think that this is a price point where you kind of have to pick and choose what you want, and you can't have really the best of both worlds. That doesn't really happen until much, much higher prices. Of the 3 IEMs, I think this is definitely my favorite. I think that the one I would probably still recommend people buy is probably that KZ. That's gonna give you a great introduction into his general mentality for tuning. And you're not gonna be dropping 200 bucks to really figure out what that's like. And if it is something that you like, then maybe graduate to something like this down the road. I do think that at $200 for an IEM, you have super, super, super steep competition. And I don't really think that this is a massive outlier, but I do think that it is playing amongst the IEMs at this price point that I would recommend. I do recommend this. I think it's for specific listeners, and that's perfectly fine. But as an overall IEM, I think this is pretty good. So for me, for the critical IEMs that I've looked at so far, I've really liked 2, the KZ and the SeeAudio, and I haven't liked 1, which is the FIO. So that's gonna wrap it up for me for now. Let me know if you want me to review more of his IEMs in the future. I'd love to check him out. I'll leave a link to his channel and this product in the description down below. All right, thanks a lot for watching. Bye.